Introducing now Augusto Lopez Claros himself. I've known him really for quite a long time, since early 90s, I think, perhaps 1990. He has been a senior fellow at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown this year. Before that, from 2011 to 2017, he was a director of the World Bank's Global Indicators Group, department responsible for the bank's Doing Business report and other international benchmarking studies. Before that, he was chief economist and director of Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. He was also the editor of the Global Competitiveness Report, the forum's flagship publication, and also written other kinds of reports. He's also published quite a few papers. Before that, he worked for several years in London in the financial sector, and before that, he was working for the International Monetary Fund for a while as their resident representative in the Russian Federation during the 1990s. If you can imagine what that would have been like at that time when the Soviet Union was being replaced by Russia and the other countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States, and he was right there trying to help them manage the economic problems. That is worth an entire story in itself, and perhaps someday we'll ask Augusto to do that for us as well. Meanwhile, let me turn this all over to Augusto.
Thank you, Robert, very much for your introduction. I wanted to say that Bahia is very sad that she cannot be with us today. And I am particularly disappointed because, as you know, this book is actually a joint effort between her and myself. And it would have been very nice for her to be here to also provide her comments and her insights. Let me begin by telling you a little bit of the background to this book. In a sense, perhaps telling you what the inspiration for it was. I have had an interest in gender issues, during the last 20, 25 years at least, as part of my professional career. I started out as a macroeconomist working in the International Monetary Fund, but over time my interests have broadened, and I have, I think, sort of become more and more interested in development issues, things like poverty and income distribution, and among them, gender. And so I became familiar over the years with the literature and studies and research that was being done on the implications and the consequences of gender inequality, with a special focus on issues of the economy, prosperity, productivity, competitiveness, and so on. And one of the things that we noticed, maybe 10, 15 years ago, by we I mean sort of economists, the academic profession, people working on gender issues in organizations like the World Bank, was that in many different parts of the world, countries, governments were using the law to discriminate against women, to curtail her rights in some way, to prevent her from making her contribution to the economy. Just to give you a couple of examples, for instance, in some countries, the law was being used to confer to the husband control over household assets. And this, of course, meant that if the wife wanted to use the property as collateral to access the financial system because she wanted to create a small enterprise or set up a business, she couldn't do that unless she had the full cooperation and support of the husband, which, of course, could not always be counted upon. And in any case, she couldn't do it in her own name. We had learned and had seen that in many countries the law was restricting women's mobility, for instance. She needed authorization from her husband to travel. She needed authorization to open up a bank account, to set up a business. We had seen in many countries that the law sometimes imposed restrictions on the kinds of jobs that women could have, or the kinds of the hours of the day in which she could work, and so on. But this evidence was kind of anecdotal. It referred to some countries in some parts of the world and so on. And at some point, at the World Bank, some researchers decided that it would be very good to actually see if we could systematize all of this information for a large number of countries by looking at essentially the entire sort of body of legislation that had an impact or had a bearing on the exercise of women's rights within the economy. And so what was done essentially for ultimately 190 countries, so essentially covering the entire world, all the membership of the World Bank and the IMF, was to look at the Constitution, at the Civil Code, at family law, at the Labor Code, at the tax code, a whole body of legislation that had something to say about women's rights within an economic framework, and to essentially try to discover from a reading of the law, what were those areas in which there was active discrimination against her. And so eventually what we did is we sort of put together a list of 44 questions for which then we attempted to find the answers by a reading of the law. As you can imagine, this was a huge effort because it involved translating all these legal instruments from Chinese into English and from Arabic into English and from French and Spanish, etc. You can imagine. And it's not just 2 or 3 pieces of legislation. It's basically a large body of legal instruments that have a bearing on this question. And the questions for which we were trying to get answers were questions such as this. I'll give you a few examples so you get a sense of where this project was headed. Does the Constitution have a clause which identifies gender as a protected category? Does the law provide equality of property rights between men and women? Does a woman need permission from her husband to travel abroad? Is it as easy for a woman to obtain a passport as it is for a man, or does it require more steps? Does it perhaps require the authorization of the husband or the father if she's not married? Can she open up a bank account freely on her own without some ulterior or alternative authorization? Does the tax code provide some benefits to men that it doesn't provide to women? Is there legislation in the country that protects women from domestic violence, and so on? I think you begin to get a flavor, right? I gave you 7, 8 examples of the kinds of questions that we were asking, the answers for which we were looking for in the law. And ultimately, we put together a list of 44 questions, and as you can imagine, over a period of time, we built up a huge database, for 190 countries. In fact, only organizations like the World Bank have the resources and the manpower and the patience and the funding, to do this kind of gigantic piece of work. And this database just provided such a rich body of insight on gender discrimination and gender inequality that as we began to sort of comb through the data and write reports about it, and as I myself, because the team that did this work was under my direction at the bank, as I began to travel around the world and speak on these issues, it just seemed to me that we needed to bring some of the insight that the data was providing into a broader international community. And that is when it occurred to me to contact Bahia. Bahia is not an economist; he's a novelist. I am the economist, and I was the person that was very much familiar with the data set. But I wanted to be able to write a story that would be accessible, that would be interesting, that would be exciting. And economists, although I have tried my best not to be boring and not to be too formal, I needed to have somebody next to me that basically would allow me to translate some of the stories that were coming out of this data set in a way that would be exciting, that would be interesting, that would be engaging, that would basically bring to the attention of the international community the kinds of insights that were coming from this data set. And so that is what we did. We worked on this. And ultimately, we went even beyond the data set and discussed other issues to which I will come in a few minutes. So let me begin by sharing with you, by way of getting this presentation started, just some of the insights that come from analyzing this data set, right? I mean, you can imagine we have thousands of data points for 190 countries across a whole range of legal instruments. And so if I'm going to sort of be productive in some way, I need to synthesize this information for you and give you half a dozen interesting insights that come out of this. And then I will make a little detour and I will tell you what are some of the other issues that Baha'i and I explored that go beyond the data itself. But one of the first things that we noticed is that that was a bit of a shock actually, is that when you look at these countries, 173 countries initially, and then a few more were added in the last round. Only 18 countries in the world, in other words, 10% roughly of all the countries in the world, have a legislation that does not discriminate against women in some way. Okay, now that's a bit of a shock if you think about it. All right. In other words, to say that 90% of the countries in the world have some aspect of the legislation that discriminates against women, that imposes some kind of restriction on her. Admittedly, in some countries, there may be 2 or 3, but there are countries where there are 10, 15, 20. In Iran, we were able to identify 27 separate forms of discrimination that are embedded in Iranian legislation against women. And one of the reasons why this data set became very powerful and really with a great deal of impact is that we are able to actually tell what are the 27 pieces of the legislation where these discriminations in Iran are identified. We can quote to you what article in the civil code embeds one of those 27 discriminations or restrictions against women. And so it's unarguable. Countries may not like it, but they more or less have to live with it because all we're doing is we're reading their law back to them, right? And so that was the first kind of shocking bit of evidence, that discrimination is such a pervasive phenomenon all over the world in the 21st century, right? And we know that we have made a lot of progress in gender equality. There are very few people who will openly claim today to be misogynist. But nevertheless, when we actually looked at the law, it was really quite shocking to see such pervasive forms of discrimination all over the world, in every corner of the world. Now, when you look at those 18 countries that have a legal framework that is completely blind with respect to issues of gender, where the legislation doesn't discriminate against women in any way, we initially thought, well, these must be all the rich countries. It must be Canada and New Zealand and the Netherlands and so on. And sure enough, these countries were there among those 18. But we also discovered that Peru was there, that the Dominican Republic was part of the 18 privilege set, that Armenia was one of them as well. And so this immediately challenged one very well-established belief that gender discrimination is actually an issue of prosperity, it's an issue of income, that ultimately when all the countries in the world are rich and prosperous, gender discrimination will have been eliminated. It will have been the result of education and the result of, a higher standard of living. And the data suggests otherwise. The data suggests that you don't need to wait to be rich and prosperous, which, by the way, means waiting a couple of 100 years in the case of the low-income countries, before you have a legislative framework that is actually fair to women, right? So that was kind of one interesting bit of data. Now, I must warn you, the fact that a country like Spain, where I am tonight, is among those 18 countries doesn't mean that there is no gender gap in Spain, right? All it means is that it has a legislation that is unbiased, that does not discriminate overtly against women. Beyond that, of course, there is always a gap between the theory, i.e. the jury, the law, and the practice. Spain is a country where there's a huge amount of violence against women, for instance. It's a country where women have become increasingly politically empowered, but are not there yet. We don't have 50% participation in the Spanish parliament or in many of the local governments. The participation of women on corporate boards of publicly listed Spanish companies is pitifully small, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make that clear, that even in these 18 countries where the law does not discriminate against women, it is still the case that there is a gender gap that manifests itself in education and employment in other areas. But I'll come to that in a few minutes. So that was one interesting insight, but there are more. For instance, one of the things that we discover is that in many countries, the introduction of legislation to protect women against violence is a relatively recent phenomenon. You know that if you go back to 1990, you can actually count in the fingers of one hand the number of countries in the world where there was a legislation that made violence against women, you know, a criminal offense. That changed over time, beginning in the early 1990s, and you know, this legislation was introduced gradually in other parts of the world. And today, I believe there are something like 127 countries where this legislation exists. Now, one of the interesting observations that the data showed was that in those countries that don't have legislation protecting women from domestic violence, the average life expectancy of women is actually lower. In other words, the absence of legislation protecting women actually manifests itself in a lot of premature mortality. Yes, it's hard to say this, but you know, women get beat up by their husbands and their boyfriends and their partners, and many of these end up dying. And so the data actually shows this in a very dramatic way. In fact, we were so impressed with this data in a kind of a dark sort of way that we began to look into, you know, could we estimate, you know, how many women have died, let's say, over the last 30 years as a result of the absence of domestic violence legislation in many of these countries. And that research actually led to some very, very sobering results. You know, I mean, literally, it looks as though the number of premature fatalities of women in the world at large as a result of the absence of this kind of legislation is in the millions. So, you know, people talk sometimes about a war against women, you know, having taken place in the last 100 years in many different parts of the world. And some people will raise their eyebrows and say, yeah, yes, of course, you know, war against women. Well, if it turns out that premature fatalities associated with violence against women is in the millions, then yes, you can actually use the phrase in a very apt way and talk about, you know, a war against women. Now, let me share a couple more insights that I think are really quite interesting before I begin to discuss other issues. We looked at the use of quotas to essentially empower women politically. You know that if you look at the participation of women in parliaments all over the world, for all the countries for which we have data, which is a large number, and indeed for all the countries for which there are parliaments, you know, we have data on the percent of parliamentarians that are women. And obviously, it will not surprise you to discover that women are underrepresented. India, to give you an example, a large country with 1.3 billion people, has in its parliament 11% women and 89% men. Even a country like the United States, which has been very much on the forefront of promoting gender equality through its legislation and so on, the participation of women in the U.S. Congress is around 20%, which is around the world average, by the way. There are countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Rwanda and surprisingly even Mexico that are much higher. They are more in the 45, 46, 47% range. Now, some countries have introduced quotas to basically accelerate this process of the political empowerment of women. 30%, 35%, in some countries even 40%. And because these quotas have been introduced at various times in various corners of the world, what we were able to do is to compare, do the existence of these quotas make any difference in terms of economic outcomes? And the result of those studies are really quite fascinating, and they begin to illustrate why is it that in the Baha'i faith the equality of men and women is such a foundational principle. Gender experts traditionally tended to see gender inequality from a kind of a human rights perspective. They would argue, correctly I think, that gender inequality is a terrible thing because it's a violation of women's rights. It's a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a violation of the UN Charter and other such founding documents. But it turns out, and I think that this is the reason why gender equality is such a fundamental principle of the Baha'i faith, it turns out that gender equality actually has many other multiple dimensions that have a whole range of implications that go well beyond just the violation of women's rights and that have to do with prosperity, with the economy, with life in the family, ultimately really with life of the spirit. I will come back to that in a few minutes. And so when we began to look at do quotas make any difference? The data was actually very encouraging in terms of the power of quotas to more rapidly narrow the gap between men and women in a way that perhaps would not happen if you just let it to, education and time and growing prosperity, over the next couple of 100 years. For instance, just at a very basic level, those countries where quotas have been in place for the participation of women in parliament have much higher levels of female labor force participation in the market. That, other things being equal, is actually good for the economy. If more women join the labor market and make their contribution to the production of goods and services, this is actually good for income per capita and for ultimately as well for productivity, because they also bring their talents and their capacities into a larger pool of talent in the economy. Then we began to look at the World Bank at things like, do quotas make a difference, for instance, in terms of the priorities of spending by governments? And here, a number of studies were done in India. India is a country where, as I said before, female labor force participation at the federal level is very low. It's 11%. But India, like the United States, is a federal country. It has a federal government, but it also has states. And the states have their own legislatures and their own state laws. And it turns out that in the 1990s, the government made it optional for states to introduce quotas at the level of village councils. The village council, for a country that is rural, is the smallest political entity in the country. You can think of it as the local spiritual assembly in a Baha'i community. So the village council traditionally were completely male-dominated in India. But in the 1990s, some of the states decided to sort of take up the government offer and introduced a 1/3, a 33% quota for women at the level of village councils. Other states didn't. And that, from an economic point of view, created a very interesting opportunity to do an experiment. You wait a few years and then you go back and you say, hey, did the quotas make any difference? And two things that I want to highlight, which are really very interesting. The first one is that if you looked at the patterns of spending at the level of the village council, you discover that in those villages where women were at 33% because of the quota, the structural expenditure was more directed towards education, towards public health, towards water projects, the kinds of infrastructures that tended to enhance the quality of the life in the community. Those village councils that were still completely male-dominated, where there was no quota, the structure of spending was different. You know, there's money going to celebrations, money going to, you know, sports facilities and, you know, other things. And so one could see immediately, you know, a very direct impact of the introduction of the quota in terms of the quality of the life in the community at the most basic level, which is the village. But what was perhaps even more interesting was that at the time that the quotas were introduced in some of these villages, surveys were done to assess men's attitudes towards the quota. And it will not surprise you to learn that the men's attitudes were very negative. They would say, well, you know, what are these women going to do? What experience do they have? Do we know whether they have any political judgment to participate in making decisions at the level of this political entity called the village council? 10 years later, when the same surveys were repeated, it was discovered that the attitude of the men had shifted in a very fundamental way. They were much more tolerant. Many of the men were actually voting for the women to be members of the village council because they recognized that, look, you know, the society hadn't collapsed as a result of the incorporation of women into the political decision-making. And so this change in mentality, this change in the mental framework of the men, you know, was perhaps the most interesting aspect of the introduction of the quotas. So, in the book, we actually, with Bahia, we go into a very detailed discussion of quotas, the evidence, you know, the pros and the cons. It will not surprise you that there are people who are against them. You know, who don't like the idea of quotas, and you know, we do a fairly clinical analysis of all these arguments, and I you know, without wanting to gloat over it, I think we do a reasonably good job of demolishing most of the arguments against the introduction of quotas. More recently, there has been an attempt to actually establish quotas for the participation of women in corporate boards. So this is not to empower women politically, but to empower them in terms of the decision making at the level of the economy, at the level of the the corporation. And the data there, I won't go into it, although we do go into it in the book. The data from that is really quite interesting as well. It's very well established that women who have higher participation in corporate boards, those companies are actually better run, they're more profitable, they're less vulnerable to corporate governance scandals and issues of fraud and corruption and so on. The data is fascinating. There was a survey done in the United Kingdom of 6,500 companies, and you split the sample in two, one with 3 or more women directors on the board, and the others with less, and it turns out that those companies that have more women are better run, and they have more loyalty from their employees. There's lower turnover of the labor force, but more importantly, they are much less vulnerable to scandals and to corruption and to the kind of sort of flaws in corporate governance that undermine confidence and ultimately affect negatively the economy. with Bahia, we entered into other areas as well that went beyond just the data set. The data set was the inspiration; it was the starting point. We touched on some of these aspects, but then we went well beyond that. For instance, the chapter on violence against women, called the virus of violence. At least among the people who reviewed the book before it was published, it was perhaps one of the more impactful, because we went into the psychology of violence against women and the background to it and where it's coming from, and the costs as well. The heavy price that we pay because of the incidence of violence. We think very often that gender equality is about women, right? It's about empowering women. It's about giving them opportunity and so on. But Abdul Baha, in a talk that he gave in Paris in 1912, brought a kind of a very interesting new insight. It seems to me. I think it's a brilliant insight into why gender equality is not a zero-sum game. That why gender equality doesn't imply loss for men, right? And let me just share, it's a very small quote, but I think it's so profound in so many ways. He said in Paris, as long as women are prevented from attaining their highest possibilities, so long will men be unable to achieve the greatness which might be theirs. In other words, everybody will gain from gender equality. In other words, men who have been the oppressors of women throughout the ages have themselves paid a very heavy price for neglecting her, for marginalizing her, for depriving her rights, for putting together legislation that goes against her interests and that prevents her from making her contribution to society. I'll share with you an anecdote that sort of comes from one observation in the data that we work with. As I said before, countries are also limiting the kinds of occupations that women can have, and this was a bit surprising. There are all kinds of jobs where, for reasons that are sometimes difficult to interpret, women cannot work. And the anecdote I wanted to share with you is a meeting I had a couple of years ago in Moscow, in Russia. Robert told you that I spent many years in the 1990s there representing the organization for which I was working at that time, which was the International Monetary Fund. But in my role as director of the indicators program at the World Bank between 2011 to 2017, I traveled extensively, and I went to Russia a few times. And the last time I was there, which was in 2016, I had a meeting at the end of my trip with the government minister. And he said to me at the end of the meeting, well, Mr. Lopez Claros, what else can we do in Russia to improve the climate, the investment climate for the private sector? Russia at that time and still today is going through a difficult period in terms of economic circumstances. It's under sanctions. It's an economy that is highly dependent on energy, on oil, and as the price of oil goes up or down, the Russian economy goes up or down. And so the government was very intent on essentially developing the private sector, contributing to diversify the economy, and so the question that he raised was relevant. And so I was prepared for that question, and I said, Minister so-and-so, what about eliminating some of the 456 occupations that are forbidden to women in the Russian Federation? And he looked at me, kind of shocked. It became clear to me at that very moment that he was not aware that this was a problem for half of the Russian population. And so he asked me to give him an example, and I said, well, Minister, the women in Russia cannot drive the metro. All the drivers of the metro system, which is very extensive and very sophisticated in Russia, are men. And he obviously had to grant that. And then instead of asking me to give him a second example, because maybe he realized that I was ready to give him 455 other examples, he said, well, that's a legacy of the Soviet Union. And, I didn't want to be confrontational. I could have said, well, but the Soviet Union ceased to exist 25 years ago. Why are these restrictions still in the books? And why are they being enforced? And so he said, oh, well, many of these restrictions have been introduced to protect women. And that's a kind of a second line of defense that is very often used by governments, to justify these restrictions. And it's not a credible defense because, how are you protecting women by preventing her from driving the metro? Accidents in the metro are very, very rare. It is no more dangerous to drive a metro than it is to drive a car in the highway. Many of these hundreds of job restrictions are actually in the energy sector, and they happen to be very highly paid. So what you have is essentially a huge wage gap between men and women in Russia. And as you can imagine, this actually contributes to undermining equity. It makes income inequality, which is already a huge global problem, worse than would otherwise be the case, right? And it's really a very inefficient allocation of resources. It undermines productivity in the overall economy because you are essentially blocking the entry of talent into the private sector, into the Russian economy from very smart, very talented women, which, as in every other country, are there in the thousands, in Russia in the millions, right? So, in the book with Bahia, we get into cultural issues as well, and this goes well beyond the data set that I was referring to. We look at the whole question of what is the religious dimension of gender discrimination? To what extent can one make the case that gender discrimination is simply a manifestation of a particular culture, and that therefore, we should respect it and we should recognize, in a world in which there is a great deal of diversity and so on. And, that in the 1990s in Afghanistan, the Taliban, who were then in power, would often make this argument. I remember very well, and we report this in the book. We actually go into a discussion of this in the book. The Security Council, the United Nations Security Council in the 1990s issued a resolution, it must have been around 93, 94, which we quote in the book, condemning the treatment of women in Afghanistan by the Taliban, the government. Girls couldn't go to school, women couldn't join the workforce. There were restrictions on their clothing, on their mobility, and so on. It was really a very, very repressive environment, and very tragic for the country. Imagine, half of your population growing up illiterate, growing up, without the right to go to school. So the UN Security Council condemned them. And the Taliban came up with a very interesting argument. They said, look, this is who we are. These are our values. This is our culture. You should respect it. You should recognize that we're different than you are. And who are you to tell us, how we should behave or what values we should have? And we argue in the book that argument is completely dishonest because, of course, what was happening in Afghanistan is that nobody was asking the women, which at that time were 11 million, nobody was asking the 11 million Afghan women, do you want to live in a world in which your girls can't go to school? Are you happy and are you okay with legislation which forbids you from working? Right? It was actually the men who appropriated for themselves the right to define what was Afghan culture, and in doing so, of course, completely ended up marginalizing women and creating a horror and a very difficult situation. Suicide rates among women in Afghanistan in the 1990s were sky high because women just basically lost all hope, you know, and so the cultural diversity is something that should be celebrated, but only if those enjoying their cultural attributes are doing so voluntarily, right? And so these are the kinds of issues that we get into the book, you know. And for those of you who would like to get the book, which by the way is easily available in Amazon, we also get into the whole question of, you know, religious absolutism and the role that religion has had in preserving or in creating many of these prejudices and deeply ingrained attitudes, you know, that go against women. Let me just mention a couple more examples, and then I will draw to a close. Obviously, you know, it's a 320-page book, and as you can imagine, all I'm doing is giving you a kind of a survey, a bit of the flavor of some of the issues that we touch upon, and then at the end, before concluding, what I'd like to do is I'd like to read a couple of paragraphs from one of the chapters, just so that you have a little bit of a flavor of, you know, the way that the book is written. The other example I wanted to give you was concerning the issue of inequality. A few months ago, through the Wilmette Institute, I was invited to give a seminar on gender inequality. I'm sorry, on income inequality. I apologize, income inequality. And one of the points I made at that time is that in discussing, you know, how to deal with the problem of income inequality, we're not giving enough attention to the issue of gender. And that there is a very, very deep, very well-established connection between discriminating and marginalizing women, preventing her from gaining access to the job market and so on, and the broader issue of inequality of income at the level of the aggregate population. And I think the intuition there is a very simple one. If you are discriminating against half of your population, if you are preventing her from making her contribution to the life of the nation, then clearly you are you know, contributing to create income inequality as well. You know, again, coming back, you know, why is it that gender equality is such a foundational principle in the faith? Let me, you know, as if I hadn't said enough things, let me give you one more. There have been studies that have shown that when women work, when they get, you know, they become educated, and then as a result of gaining skills and knowledge and education, they join the labor force. This leads to a shift in the balance of power within the family. Again, that's intuitive. It should not surprise you. When the woman contributes to the budget of the family, she has more power in terms of deciding how to use those resources. And studies have been done which actually show that in those families where the woman is thus empowered, the allocation of expenditure shifts very, very dramatically. Much more money gets spent on education of children, on public health, on the savings behavior of the family is much healthier, much better. The credit rating of the family where the woman works is better than is otherwise the case when she doesn't work. Investment decisions are wiser and more, you know, have more beneficial implications for the overall prosperity of the family. And so again, here you come back, you know, why is it that the Baha'i writings, and Abdul Baha in particular, as he was traveling in America and in Europe, came repeatedly to the issue of gender equality? It was because I think he understood that this is not just about, you know, creating an environment that is fair for women and that recognizes their rights. This has vast implications in a whole range of other areas, such as, you know, spending habits at the level of the family, which then contribute to enhance the quality of the human capital in the family, and that therefore are an investment in the future generation, and therefore have these intergenerational implications that are beneficial for prosperity and for income per capita and for other indicators of human welfare, right? So let me, incidentally, we also in the book touch on the question of security. In other words, it isn't just about the economy and prosperity. Abdul Baha, when he was in Philadelphia in 1912, he gave a very powerful talk, and there he said something that to me is so it resonates deeply with me. This particular quote. He said, "Equality between men and women is conducive to the abolition of warfare, for the reason that women will never be willing to sanction it. Mothers will not give their sons as sacrifices upon the battlefield after 20 years of anxiety and loving devotion in rearing them from infancy, no matter what cause they are called upon to defend. There is no doubt that when women obtain equality of rights, war will entirely cease among mankind." And so to conclude, let me share this just a couple of paragraphs from one of the chapters in the book, and I am happy to tell you that in this particular passage, which I will read, is very much Bahia's very eloquent pen. This is sort of the concluding section of the chapter called "The Culture Question," where we deal with these very thorny issues of, cultural exceptionalism and the role of religion and patriarchy and so on. And so these are the two paragraphs that I want to share with you. It'll take 3 minutes, no more than that. On March 19, 2015, a terrible crime took place outside the main mosque in Kabul. A young woman was kicked, beaten, run over, dragged through the streets behind a truck, and finally burned before being thrown in a polluted river. She had been accused by the mullah in the mosque of committing blasphemy. Several young men who heard the cleric raise his voice against her then dragged her out of the mosque, incited into a frenzy of revenge. The crowd that gathered was told that she was an apostate who had burned the Quran and deserved to die. Several policemen standing by did nothing to defend her. Many took videos of the attack. Highly placed officials, including a female political figure, claimed that such retaliation was justified. The woman's family vouched that she was mentally unstable, but by then she was dead. The internet was flooded with her blood-reddened face as she begged to know what her sin had been. After the furor died down, journalists, women's activists, and international human rights organizations began asking the same question, and it gradually emerged that the woman, Farhunda, who was 27 years old, had committed no sin at all. In fact, she was a devout Muslim, a religious scholar herself who had just qualified as a teacher and knew the Quran by heart. She had been remonstrating with the mullah in the mosque about his monopoly on selling talisman and holy amulets to the women. In other words, her real crime had been to break with tradition. Her only blasphemy had been to argue with a cleric. Her so-called act of apostasy had been to make a distinction between the injunctions in the Quran and the superstitions being sold to a bunch of uneducated women whose children would go hungry if they wasted their money on such rubbish. The mullah's fury against her for undermining his reputation and his means of livelihood led to false accusations and incitement of the crowd. Even her family, it was later said, had been intimidated into saying that she was mentally unbalanced because they feared for their reputation. This kind of behavior should not be dignified by being called religious. It was a glaring example of a cultural crime. When the remains of the women were gathered up and prepared for burial, the women of Kabul took the unique step of breaking with tradition. They refused to allow the prayer leader of the mosque to preside over her funeral and turned him away. Furthermore, they violated the custom that women should remain at the back of the crowd during a funeral and strode in front of the mourners, wearing masks of the woman's blood-drenched face. They carried her coffin to the graveyard themselves. It was unprecedented. What was even more significant was that a large circle of men surrounded and protected them as they challenged the custom of their country. This remarkable action, which echoed events that had taken place a month before in the wake of the attack on the psychology student in the southern Turkish province of Mersin, showed a growing awareness by many in Kabul, men and women alike, of the distinctions between a cultural tradition and divine injunction, between custom and religious faith. Only when social laws are differentiated from spiritual principles can gender equality finally be recognized. Robert, back to you.
Thank you very much. This was absolutely fascinating, Augusto. The statistics are amazing and in some cases quite chilling. And I'm very grateful that you were able to put this book together with Baha'i Nakhjavani. I do have a couple of questions myself, and then I'll take questions from the audience as well. Why do you think that companies with women on the boards have fewer scandals? For example, it could very well be that the women themselves, of course, won't tolerate them. It could also be that the men feel that, you know, boys can't be boys when women are around, and so they have to behave themselves. Maybe that's saying the same thing, I don't know, but have people any idea why companies have fewer scandals with women on the board?
It's a very good question, Robert. You know, we looked at the criminology literature, and the criminology literature has already established for several decades that the propensity of men to crime is much higher than it is for women. All right, mm-hmm. And I'm not making a sort of a loaded, politically incorrect statement. The data shows this very, very clear. The jails in America and most countries in the world are overwhelmingly occupied by men.
Right.
At the World Bank, we have done studies looking at whether there is a gender dimension to corruption. Right, the incidence of bribery and all kinds of violation of ethical laws. And there also, there is a very clear, sharp distinction. The, corruption, bribery, and so on is by and large, not exclusively, by and large, a male phenomenon. So, let me give you a kind of a slightly different perspective on this. In November of this year, I was attending the Paris Peace Forum, which was called by President Macron to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And it was a kind of a very gripping occasion. And one of the speakers, I think it was Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, pointed out that World War I was basically a sleepwalker's war. We sleepwalked into it. It was, right. It was a war that, unlike the Second World War, where you could make the argument that we went into war to defeat an abhorrent ideology, Nazism, because we didn't want Hitler to rule the world. World War I was a totally pointless conflict that ultimately killed 17 million people, right? Well, right. If you make a list of the 100 most important people in 1914 that had a bearing on getting the war started and getting the war executed, all 100 of them are men, right?
Yeah.
Right? Which is the reason why Abdul Baha again emphasizes, the importance of the integration of women into every aspect of society, because he is saying we're paying a very heavy price in terms of prosperity, in terms of corruption, in terms of warfare, by having marginalized women and by having kicked her out of the decision-making process, right? When women are present in corporate boards, it seems to me that men are more cautious. They are less willing to do stupid things because they are looking at the short term. Mm-hmm. They are less willing to cook up the emission standards of the cars being produced by the auto company, for short term profit. And I think, it's not something that surprises me. I mean, for those of us who have been married for many years, how many mistakes have our wives actually prevented us from making, right?
That's true.
So I don't have, I make no important decisions in my life without consulting my wife, right? And it is not because, she will get upset at me. It is because I value her judgment, and because she brings inevitably a different perspective on issues,
Right.
And I think that is the way decision making is supposed to be. We're supposed to complement each other. We're supposed to work together and bring our different perspectives so that we can make a more intelligent decision.
Sure. I think that's a good answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. Runa asks, this is a long one. I may have to move my cursor a bit here in the middle. Thank you for your talk. I noticed your book is on Audible, so we'll listen to it. I think she means this presentation. Our LSA here in Canada, out of all places, had one woman on it. What are your thoughts on how to help the community that is in denial, she adds, to acknowledge that true equality is not easily attained, the transformation required is difficult for men and women alike, that effort is needed to continue to enhance your understanding, the operation of this principle, and to strive to uphold it in our elections?
Yeah. Well, I think you have answered your own question, actually. I'm not sure that I totally agree with what you have said. I think that one of the challenges that we face is that, we Baha'is come, of course, with our own cultural baggage, right? I come from a part of the world, Latin America, that is very male-dominated, where there are very deeply ingrained attitudes about the role of men and women. I had the bounty of being born into a family where my mother was already Baha'i, and I think that she made an effort to educate me in the principles of the faith. But if you ask me, have I been completely immune from the culture around me, from the kinds of attitudes that were prevalent among my classmates and in school and their fathers and so on? And the answer is probably most likely not. So one has to be especially vigilant, in terms of not making assumptions that reflect not the teachings of Baha'u'llah, but the cultural values and the practices and traditions of the countries that we come from.
Yeah, I think your entire talk, in a way, is also a response to Runa's question. The account of the councils in India, village councils in India, that have more women on them, the accounts of the legislatures, the account of all of the laws that restrict women and the impact they have economically and on the murder rate, really, I think, answer the question really very eloquently as well. Shahla says, it is also true that almost all clergy are men. How do we hope for this to change to prevent the savagery that you just read about and other atrocities?
Yeah. Legislation helps. Having laws that protect women help. I said that the number of countries that have this kind of legislation has increased very rapidly. But having said that, there are dozens and dozens of countries where such legislation does not exist. And this has real life implications for women. Women get killed because it's not a crime to commit violence against them. So I think there is a role for civil society here, to basically press governments, to introduce these kinds of legal protections again, for women. They make a difference. There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was wondering about the source of the data that you were able to use, which is from the International Monetary Fund. And I suppose there must have been some scholarly publications that released it as well as your book. And I was wondering about that.
Yeah, actually the source of the data is the World Bank. It's not the IMF.
Oh,
it's the
World Bank.
Yeah, it's the World Bank. And the book is not about the data set, from the World Bank. The book was inspired by that data set and used the data set as a kind of a stepping stone to illustrate a few things, and then it went well beyond that. But that data set is available. It's publicly available. Actually, the project is called Women, Business, and the Law. Mm-hmm. Women, Business, and the Law. And if you just type that in Google, it will take you to the website of the project, and you can download the data. And if you're interested in finding out what are the 27 restrictions for Iran, go to the page, to the Iran page in the report, and you will see them. You will see them. It's actually a very interesting data set, which is beginning to have an impact in kind of moving countries to change their legislation, because now that it is transparent, it's publicly available, it is embarrassing in a good way, many governments into action. Many governments are recognizing, hey, these things are there, and is there a reason for them being there? And very often the answer is no. Very often the answer is, well, actually, it's inertia. It's the legislature is not getting their act together, to do something about it. And so, I would certainly encourage you to look at that. But part of the reason we wrote the book was also to make some of that data alive, to make it come out alive. The story that I read about Farhund in Afghanistan, is one way to illustrate, the importance of having legislation that protects women from violence. Afghanistan doesn't have that legislation. And it is for that reason that young woman could be attacked with such impunity, and nobody gets punished for it, right? So the reason why I wanted to bring Bahia into this project is that she could help me add life to some of these stories, and present the data in a way that was accessible and interesting. And ultimately, Robert, one thing I wanted to say is that I think that our motivation as authors was essentially to deliver to the Baha'i community as well a whole range of data and insight and arguments to essentially make an even stronger case when we're teaching the faith about the importance of gender equality, right? In other words, what is the typical approach of a Baha'i when he talks about gender equality to a non-Baha'i, right? We go back to the wonderful analogy of the mankind is a bird with two wings, et cetera, right? Which is beautiful. It's very true. It's a wonderful analogy, right? But in a sense, in the book, what we're trying to do, I hope with some humility, is to give you 100 more reasons that you can use with your contacts and with your friends to explain to them why is it that gender inequality is so central, not just to the Baha'i faith, but to the future of the world, to human prosperity and to human security, right? And so I think that if you read the book and if you become familiar with a dozen of the examples that we give you, it will enrich your dialogue and your interactions with your non-Baha'i friends.
Yeah, and the exact title again is Equality of Women Equals, with an equal sign, Prosperity for All. And I assume it's available then over Amazon and all that, of course.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Susan asks, is there any data on the participation of women in financial planning and financial security? I don't know what that exactly is asking for, other than that.
That the IMF, and this time it is the IMF, not the World Bank. The IMF did. The IMF is for the first time being led by a woman, right? By Christine Lagarde. She used to be the French finance minister, and some 6-7 years ago she was appointed as head of the IMF, and she has actually brought gender equality into I don't want to say the mainstream of the work of the organization, but has given it a much greater prominence. And the IMF recently released a couple of interesting studies, and one of the studies showed that with a specific reference to the financial sector, right? The financial sector, the higher share of women on boards is associated with greater financial resilience, right? In other words, they focus not on the whole corporate sector, you know, the Apples and the Googles and the Amazons, but just the banking sector, you know, institutions working in the financial sector. And they looked at the composition of boards there, and they were able to see that where there is higher participation of women on the board, you know, there is higher, what they say, higher financial resilience. And then the other study that they did was that they looked at banking supervision boards. In every country, there is typically an institution that is dependent on the central bank, that is like as a group of auditors who look at banking supervision issues, you know, to make sure that the banks are fulfilling all the sort of criteria, you know, for stability and so on. And what they discovered is that in those countries where there is a greater participation of women on the supervision boards, then there is much greater financial stability in the country. Less cases of banks that go belly up, that have to be intervened, and so on. So even here, in something that is arguably a very technical area, you know,
right?
Banking supervision is boring. You have to be an accountant for it. You know, you have to be looking at balance sheets and so on. Even there, the presence of women makes a difference in terms of the stability of the financial sector, right? I myself, having worked in the financial sector for many years in London, when I look at the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, I have no doubt that to some extent, not fully, but to some extent, it reflected the overwhelming presence of men in the financial sector, among traders, among brokers, among loan operators, and so on.
That's very interesting. I'm sure you could say pretty much the same thing about the failure of Bearing Bank, where that one man brought the whole thing down because people weren't watching the loans he was making and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Again, you've got those kinds of problems with a lot of men supervising each other and perhaps trusting each other too much, or not being diligent with their duties. That's fascinating. That's a fascinating comment. How did you all divide up the writing of the book? How did you do that?
It was kind of a very collaborative work. Let me give you an example. I had written a couple of years before a paper on culture and development, right? Culture and development. Had, you know, taken a kind of a deep look at, you know, is there a cultural dimension to development? I mean, is the fact that Japan became a global economic power between 1870 and 1930, can some of that be explained by cultural factors, right? And so I had done that work, and so I share that with Baha'i, and that was the starting point for the chapter that you see in the culture question, right? So it's very much of a joint effort. You know, I did the first part, I laid out many of the arguments, you know, and then, you know, she took over and she added some more, and then she sent that to me, and then, you know, we sort of traded, and we would work on each other's texts and talk on the phone and so on, right? The question of violence against women, for instance, that was, again, the part of the chapter that has to do with talking about the costs, talking about the legislation, talking about you know, coming up with metrics that allow you to estimate the impact of violence against women all over the world. You know, I took the lead way there because it's very much an economist's work. But when it came to writing some very gripping stories about Farhunda in Afghanistan, about Jyoti in India, about another young woman in Turkey, and illustrating and sort of sharing with the reader the human side of those stories. She obviously was the one who wrote those stories, and what I read about Farhunda is very much Bahia's pen, right? So it's a kind of a collaborative effort. I think it worked very well. I think it also helped that we have been friends for a long time, right?
Yes.
So we could be patient with each other.
That's marvelous. Well, I think we don't have any other questions coming in, and I know you have a dinner across the street at a hotel very soon. So I want to thank you again, Augusto. This was a fascinating presentation. And certainly I'm very grateful to have all these very, very specific examples of the importance of giving women economic equality with men, and legal equality with men, social equality with men, and the impact that it has really on everybody, impacts on the entire society. And it's a very convincing argument. So thank you very much for that.